Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Mark Stout on the foundations of American intelligence. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter. Welcome, everyone, to Inside Intelligence. And we welcome Mark Stout today, who's going to talk about the foundations of American intelligence. Mark Stout taught at the advanced academic programs here at Johns Hopkins since 2007. From 2013 to 2021, he was director of the Master of Art Global Security Studies here, and he directed the Certificate in Intelligence from 2014 to 2019. He also worked as an intelligence analyst himself, first at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research and later with the CIA. He worked for the Army staff at Pentagon and also at the Institute for Defense Analyses. From 2010 to 2013, he was the historian at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. He is co-editor of Georgetown University Press Studies and Intelligence History book series and a contributing editor at War on the Rocks and founding president of the North American Society for Intelligence History. He's the co-author or editor of several books and is published in the Journal of Strategic Studies, Intelligence and National Security, Studies in Intelligence, and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. He also has a book coming out on American intelligence in World War I, which is under contract to the University Press of Kansas. Dr. Stout has degrees from Stanford and Harvard universities and a PhD in history from the University of Leeds. His research interests include American intelligence history and military thought, and we welcome him to our program. Thanks very much for coming. Let's talk about the foundations of American intelligence today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael, for having me. First off, it's a real pleasure to be here and to be among old friends. So what I want to talk about today is actually keying off of my book, which is due out in about 3 weeks from the University Press of Kansas. It's called World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence. And this project was suggested to me more years ago than I'm going to tell you by someone who said, hey, Mark, you ought to do something about World War I intelligence, American intelligence. And my immediate thought was like, that's a silly idea. Surely this has been done to death, because I knew that World War II intelligence had been done to death. But no, actually, that turned out not to be the case. And it was a great topic, a lot of room to almost anything you wanted to do, and it was new. And as I was researching this and writing it, I really began to see that World War I is the foundational era for American intelligence. Now, I should note that, in a maybe a more narrow sense, seeing the foundations of American intelligence in World War I in some ways isn't novel, because if you're somebody who studies domestic surveillance and the use of intelligence services to repress marginalized groups and labor unions and that sort of thing, there's a lot of scholarship about that happening in World War I. And if you're a scholar of code breaking, right, the American Black Chamber comes out of World War I. William Friedman, who led the team that broke the Japanese purple cipher system, came out of World War I. But what I found was broader than that. And basically my kind of bottom line finding here is that if you're interested in the origins of modern American intelligence, there's really two ways of thinking about this. And if what you're fundamentally interested in is more or less today's current legal structures, the more or less current lineup of agencies, then it dates to the National Security Act of 1947 that created the CIA and the National Security Council and the Air Force, and then shortly thereafter the Department of Defense, with honorable mention for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, which evolves into CIA. On the other hand, if what you're interested in is what intelligence personnel were actually doing, and why they were doing it, and why they thought they were doing it, it's all there by the end of World War I. So at the end of World War I, you have people collecting overt human intelligence. You have people conducting clandestine human intelligence or espionage operations. You've got code makers and code breakers. You've got people doing aerial reconnaissance and photo interpretation. You've got analysts, intelligence analysts. You've got people doing counterintelligence and counterespionage. You've even got some bits and pieces of covert action. Now, all of this gets anemic during the interwar period, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it all continues. Except for covert action, basically, you can see it, all of these things continuing from World War I into World War II, which, of course, then takes us to the Cold War. A lot of people might imagine, I thought initially that really, a lot of the foundations of American intelligence would be in the Civil War. And that actually turns out not to be true. Now, of course, the Union Army and actually also the Confederates were very active and did a lot of things in intelligence and fairly sophisticated things during the Civil War. But of course, at the end of that war, the Confederacy ceases to exist as a political entity, so it's not going to have a legacy. But also the Union does not remember these lessons and remember what it did. And the reason for this is that intelligence was a function within the individual armies within the Union Army, and they all got disbanded, right? So it wasn't being done at a Washington level, and so those lessons got forgotten. And it wasn't until then, the late 70s and the 1870s and the early 1880s, when you started to get a military reform movement as the U.S. military is coming out of the post-Civil War doldrums, that you start to get the first glimmerings. You get the establishment of the Office of Naval Intelligence, which still exists today. It was established in 1883. You get the establishment of what soon would be called the Military Intelligence Division in the War Department in 1885, and that continues today as the U.S. Army G2. And so that became enduring peacetime and wartime organizations in the 1880s. Also, you get the sort of start, really, of the military attaché system overseas. And then in 1893, you get the first intelligence textbook written in the United States, which actually will be used by the U.S. Army and the National Guards until right up, just very shortly before World War I all gets started. But it's really World War I itself that kicks this invention, if you will, of American intelligence into high gear. And we went, of course, the United States enters that war late from a European perspective, right? The war started in 1914. We didn't declare war until April 1917. So unsurprisingly, at the moment that the United States entered World War I, we were very far behind what was now cutting edge, European standards for doing intelligence. But by the end of the war, by November 11th, 1918, when the guns fell silent, I think we were an entirely respectable partner for British and French intelligence. And of course, the British and the French had provided extensive advice and training and allowed us to literally copy their field manuals and things like this to build up our intelligence capability. And we worked very closely with them in a whole lot of areas. So I thought I'd talk just briefly about the various intelligence disciplines and what, where they were in World War I. So, of course, on the overt human intelligence side, the military and naval attachés continue operating around the world. U.S. diplomats continue sending in diplomatic reporting from around the world. So that's not really a change. What you do see, though, is a great increase in the conduct of espionage. And previously, there had been very few efforts at espionage, and most of what there had been pretty unsophisticated. Things like, in the late 19th century, putting an army officer on leave and having him go on vacation to Canada to gather data so we can make better maps of Canada, right? Not real high-speed stuff. And things, along those lines continue during World War I. A lot of what American spies collected during World War I was visual intelligence, like literally just looking at stuff. But there was also an increasing emphasis on what David Kahn has called collecting verbal intelligence. So stealing documents, for instance, or reporting what was said in a meeting. And this reflects the fact that by the World War I era, or in World War I, you get to have large bureaucracies which are conducting wars. Indeed, in a lot of sense, like entire societies at war with each other. It's not the more sort of self-contained kind of thing that you saw in the Civil War, the Napoleonic era, right? So you get espionage that starts to look much more like what we're used to in terms of Cold War espionage. A lot of the bulk of this espionage was done by the military and naval attachés or people that they hired as sort of sub-agents for that purpose. The State Department, however, did create an espionage organization, which will continue running until 1927. It was very small, but they did that. And also towards the end of the war, there started to be some use of what today we would call NOCs, intelligence officers under non-official cover, under business cover particularly. So what were some of the things they were collecting? Attachés out of Denmark were recruiting people in German territory to be part of train launching networks so that they could report on German military units moving from the Eastern Front to the Western Front or, whatever. In the Netherlands, the Army attaché recruited someone who had access, a German who had access to information that the German government sort of updated, I think, every week or 2 weeks of what the German government did not want printed in German newspapers, which was useful to know. What are the Germans sensitive about? A consular officer in Switzerland working for State Department intelligence had a small stable of sources in the German Navy who may or may not have been feeding him disinformation. That's still not entirely clear, but they were running clandestine operations against the German military out of Switzerland. And also something we saw in espionage in World War I that's very reminiscent of what we see later in World War II and the Cold War is espionage being run out of neutral countries, notably Switzerland, but other places as well. I also think World War I saw the beginnings of the love affair between American intelligence and high technology, signals intelligence particularly, signals intelligence and aerial photography. On the SIGINT side, in the American Expeditionary Forces in Pershing's army in France, you had signal corps units that were collecting communications intercepts, also direction finding German radios. And then you had a code breaking office called G2A6. William Friedman, whom I mentioned earlier, went on to be very important code breaker in the interwar period in World War II, worked in that shop. They also invented traffic analysis, which they called goniometry at the time. So traffic analysis is basically, without reading the content of radio messages, just looking at the patterns of communication, who's talking to whom, when, and in what volume, you can draw useful inferences, like, for instance, a warning of impending German attacks. And the code breaking made important contributions at the tactical level, not so much at strategic level, but at the tactical level of the war. And meanwhile, back in Washington, the War Department's Military Intelligence Division had an office called MI8, led by a man named Herbert Yardley, whom you may have heard of. Of course, in the interwar period, MI8 is going to be rebranded as the American Black Chamber. A lot of what they were doing focused on breaking into enciphered diplomatic communications from countries like Mexico. Frequently, these communications were not intercepted out of the air, but were actually acquired through espionage, including by the State Department. And there was even a clandestine component of the censorship office in military intelligence in Washington that ran an intercept facility in Maine, and another one actually in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. On the aerial photography side, you had a profusion of what were called observation squadrons in World War I. Every Army corps that was in the line had an observation wing. The first U.S. Army and the second U.S. Army, when it got created right towards the end of the war, had their own observation wings, and then an associated infrastructure of squadron-level intelligence officers who would both send the intel take from those aircraft up the chain, but also be recipients for other forms of intelligence coming down the chain that would affect the work of these observation squadrons. And aerial photography was really highly valued because it was really precise visual information, right? You could learn exactly where a German, artillery emplacement was, or exactly how far the German second trench line was behind the front trench line. And you can know these things with extreme precision. It seemed very scientific. And of course, the advent of aerial photography sets off a countermeasure cycle between, photo interpreters on one hand and people doing camouflage and deception on the other, a cycle that still continues. You also had intelligence analysis going on, both in Washington, in the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Military Intelligence Division, but also in the American Expeditionary Forces. And a lot of these folks were doing what we would call all-source intelligence analysis, right? Drawing inputs from all kinds of different means of collection. The primary consumers were the military commanders in the field, not so much the senior U.S. government decision makers, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. Most important work they probably did in France certainly was order of battle analysis. What exactly is the strength and organization and makeup of the German military that we're facing right now? And they would share that information with the British and the French, and they would share their order of battle analysis with us because, for example, a German division that disappeared from in front of the U.S. Army might appear 2 days later opposite the French Army, or vice versa. So it was in everybody's interest to share. Covert action. Little bits and pieces of it. This was less organized. This was more sort of, a lot of one-off things. And of course, the whole legal apparatus of presidents having to sign a presidential finding and a memorandum of notification to Congress and all that, none of that existed. But in revolutionary Russia, you had the attachés working again closely with the British and the French, trying to prevent Russian munitions after Russia got out of the war from falling into German hands. And they did this in every, way from, sabotage to fomenting strikes among Russian railway workers and all sorts of skullduggery. You had a small shop in the American Expeditionary Forces that worked very hard to incite uprisings among various ethnic groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, actually led by a Czech immigrant, and also to conduct sabotage there. You had an attaché in Sweden who worked with British intelligence to set up a pro-Allied Swedish news service because the existing main Swedish news service tilted towards the Germans. All sorts of things going on here, and then on the counterintelligence and more broadly kind of counter-subversion side, there was a great deal of effort, particularly in the United States itself, throughout the entire United States. And the big players here were Naval Intelligence, War Department Intelligence, and also, and I don't talk about it too much in the book, but the Bureau of Investigation in the Justice Department, which later on would be renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And there was a sense that this was important because there was a sense, one, that Germany had spies everywhere, which utterly wasn't true, but that was part of the stereotype of Germans. And also that because this is a war where they perceive the entire national systems against each other, that things like morale and public support for the war were, in every bit as important a part of the war effort as, people shooting machine guns in the frontline trenches. A lot of this domestic surveillance was, we can now see, excessive, even abusive. There was, for instance, a great deal of suspicion of the Lutheran Church, which, after all, most of the Lutherans in America at that time were Germans. And in fact, it's not well remembered these days, but at this time, the second most commonly spoken language in the United States was not Spanish, as it is today. It was German. And a lot of these Lutheran services were being conducted in German, and God knows what they're, telling the flock. I think you can see some analogs here, actually, to the surveillance of the Muslim community in the United States after 9/11. There was also surveillance of African Americans in the South, of the international workers of the world, the Wobblies out west, and all sorts of other groups. And they were, as I was just suggesting, not just looking for actual espionage of actual spies who would be sending secrets to Germany. There was very little, verging on none of that actually happening, but also it's subversion, defeatism, draft evasion, the spreading of unhelpful rumors, all this sort of thing. And one thing that they did, that the Bureau of Investigation, or the Justice Department rather, did, was to give a sort of an imprimatur to the efforts of a private organization called the American Protective League. This was a volunteer organization originally founded actually shortly before we entered the war by 3 businessmen in Chicago, which helped out the intelligence services and the Bureau of Investigation conduct investigations in their conduct of investigations, and again, engaged in a lot of abuses. So there would be basically the seamless web of surveillance of the U.S. population generally, and then heavy surveillance, secret surveillance within the army camps where units were being formed, I even recruited the YMCA to spy on the young soldiers who came to talk to YMCA personnel. And then there would be counterintelligence people looking for spies and saboteurs on the ships crossing the Atlantic in the rear areas of France, and the surveillance of the soldiers would continue right up into the front lines. And one other just real brief note on counterintelligence. The military attaches overseas and also the Allied intelligence services would advise the State Department on who to give visas to or deny visas to. Somebody wants to come to the United States, they'd look like, do these people have like connections with Germany and somehow we should keep them out? So there's a whole lot of things going on during World War I. And as I say, as is the American way, at the end of the war, there's this massive demobilization of sort of the military and the war effort. But all of this gets emaciated. Well, aside from covert action, it doesn't actually go away during the interwar period. I think you can see a lot of continuity from the American intelligence efforts in World War I into World War II, and then obviously World War II connects fairly seamlessly in intelligence terms with the Cold War. So you see this, and there's a few personnel who worked in intel in World War I who did it again in World War II. One or two even continue into the Cold War. Army and Navy intelligence continue to exist throughout this entire period. State Department, both the American Black Chamber and also its espionage organizations continue into the late 20s. The U.S. would never again be without a code-breaking organization. And indeed, during the interwar period, we established a network of intercept stations in numerous places, both domestically here and also abroad. Military force structure would be affected. The U.S. Army would never again be without observation squadrons, without aerial reconnaissance units. And you see it also carrying through in doctrine and know-how. U.S. Army manuals now say that Army forces in the field will have intelligence staffs and intelligence officers, which before World War I was not mandated. There was nothing to stop a commander from doing that, and some did and some didn't, right? But now, thou shalt. Right. And indeed, you see more broadly, you see a proliferation of doctrinal manuals discussing all aspects of intelligence related to the military. And I guess I'll just close with sort of one other example here. At the very end of World War I, the War Department's Military Intelligence Division, like other components of the War Department and the Army, decided we're going to write an official history of like what we did during the war. But they decided to write it classified, not unclassified. And so not to have it sort of be meant to be outward public facing, but to be done in one copy, classified, so that they could let it all hang out, like what worked, what we screwed up, all of that. The final product is 2,200 pages long. I've read it. It's big. There's a lot there. But what's important is that at least I can document into the mid-1930s officers who were being assigned to Army intelligence in Washington. And the first several days they were there, they would literally be put in an office and given this official history and said, "Oh, read it," right? And after you're done, we'll actually put you to work. So ultimately, then, my overall conclusion is that I think that an American intelligence officer of 1918, at least a reasonably savvy one, could have had a really meaningful professional conversation with his opposite number, or in a few cases, her opposite number, of World War II, or even really early Cold War. So that's a quick overview of the research that I've been doing.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think it's fascinating. I mean, we're sort of, in some sense, what you've discovered is really an overlooked era, of how this developed. I mean, we need to rethink sort of the way our current institutions develop in some sense. One thing, there's a lot of stuff that came up that are really interesting to me as we were talking. And by the way, folks, please put a question in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to it. But let's. One thing I was thinking about was, did the Office of Naval Intelligence, did MID, did they have order of battles already developed before the war, or were they scrambling to come up with something once we got in 1917?
Yeah. So they tended to have reference works about major countries that would look more like, not so dissimilar to fleshed out versions of the CIA World Fact Book, if you will. I mean, they're more in depth than that, but yeah, but tended not to have good order or even marginal order of battle information on the belligerents. Until we entered the war, they just weren't in a position to collect that kind of information. So no, but also on the Army side, and the locus of the order of battle analysis, of course, was actually done by the American Expeditionary Forces intelligence shop in France, like Pershing's intel shop, not in Washington. But when the Americans arrive, right, it is in the enlightened self-interest of the British and the French to share with them, like, here's what we know, right? Because a bunch of this is now going to be, opposite you when you start getting into the front lines. And they also shared with the Americans the methodologies that they had developed, particularly the French methodologies they had developed for doing order of battle analysis. So, we were very much behind when we entered the war, but we learned quickly, and it was in the interest of our allies we were going to be fighting alongside for them to teach us quickly, get us up to speed, because they didn't want us to be the weak link. Right, because if the Americans, for instance, suffer a surprise attack, well, that's every bit as much a danger of the French lines on our, right and left, or the British lines, as it is directly to the Americans. So we had a lot of help.
How much did our experience in the wars prior to this, in the Spanish-American War and the Philippines insurgency, right? How much did that contribute to our understanding what we would later bring into the conflict in Europe?
Yeah, no, really interesting question. So I think there's two different answers to that. One with regard to the Spanish-American War, and one with regard to the Philippine War, that decade or so long insurgency that spun out of the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War directly, not a whole lot. And indeed, the American commander on the ground in Cuba, the Army commander on the ground in Cuba, actually didn't want to have an intelligence staff or an intelligence officer. He told them pound sand, right? And on the counterintelligence and counterespionage side, there was very briefly this big, sort of scare about Spanish spies being potentially everywhere. And the military, both the Army and the Navy, were like, oh, we don't want to do this grubby work of counterespionage. And they had to go to the U.S. Secret Service. Very different than from what we saw in World War I, where they were all about doing counterintelligence and counterespionage. But the Philippines War is a more important predecessor of our intelligence experience in World War I in a couple of ways. So first off, Ralph Van Diemen, who becomes known as the father of American military intelligence and heads MID real roughly for the first year that we're in the war, and then goes off to be basically a sort of a roving intel troubleshooter on Pershing's staff. He has experience as an intelligence officer in the Philippines, and he's in fact particularly interested in counterintelligence kinds of issues, and he brings a lot of that expertise to the military intelligence division, and particularly its orientation, which was really heavily on domestic intelligence and counterintelligence. And also in the Philippines, you saw during that insurgency, you saw intelligence folks developing a lot of good practices that are going to be brought back and applied to American intelligence more broadly. So, for instance, things like, so you're conducting a counterinsurgency. So you have U.S. Army units all over the Philippines, and they will have little intelligence shops, and they'll collect information on the insurgents that they've identified who are operating in their area. And they came up with a great system where they would keep this in card files, which were actually a relatively recent information technology invention at that point. They keep a card file. And every time they learned about a new insurgent or got information about an insurgent they already had in their card file, they'd write a new card or update the card, and they'd make a copy, and they keep that themselves, and they make a copy, and they'd send it up to the next echelon. So that you get this sort of broad-based, common picture, common intelligence picture to be shared. So there's a lot of things that are, and indeed a number of other, actually quite a number of other people who would go on to be either intelligence officers or important consumers of intelligence, or had experience in the intel realm in the Philippines War. So it was an important predecessor to what the United States did in World War I in terms of intelligence.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership. So, one of the first things you think about is, what is the president reading? What were they interested in Wilson's cabinet? Did they find intelligence to be something useful, something vaguely disreputable? How would you characterize Woodrow Wilson's attitude toward American intelligence?
Woodrow Wilson found everything to do with intelligence to be kind of distasteful. And he tended to like to punt on intelligence issues. So, for instance, in 1915, there's so after World War I starts, but before we enter it, so it's about a 2.5 year period there. You have a lot of German and also to some degree Austro-Hungarian espionage and sabotage and even subversion in the United States. And this starts to become like a kind of a big deal. They actually, for instance, firebombed something like 30 ships, leaving American harbors heading towards Britain or France. So this becomes something you can't ignore. And the State Department and other organizations like the Secret Service and the Treasury Department and the Bureau of Investigation start like, okay, we need to work on this. And there's starting to be a food fight as to who would have the lead responsibilities for domestic counterintelligence. The cabinet level people couldn't agree amongst themselves. And so they took it to Wilson and they said, we need a decision on this. And he said, I don't want to think about this. Y'all figure it out yourselves. Right. And there were a couple of other analogous occasions where Wilson just said, nah, you deal with it. I don't want to hear about it. So that's number one. Number two, Washington didn't play much of a role in, or let me rephrase this. Washington didn't play anything like the kind of role it plays today in the conduct of the war, right? In France, Pershing was very much his own boss. There's some personality reasons for that, but even more important is the fact that communications connectivity was pretty darn minimal, right? So you could send written instructions to France on a ship, which would take days and days and days. There were submarine telegraph connections,
right.
But one of the things I found was what we would call a bandwidth study done on transatlantic cables shortly before the United States entered the war. It was done by the Brits, actually. And sort of super roughly translating it into American terms, there was about 10 megabytes a month of bandwidth for the AEF to communicate with Washington every month, going each direction. That's not a lot. And that's not for intel, that's for everything, right? So Washington didn't play a super big role in directing the conduct of the war. The only thing that I ran across where Wilson was like personally really interested in intelligence during the war was, I think I mentioned in passing that there had been a consular officer named James McNally who was operating out of Switzerland and who was, running one or more officers in the German Navy who were reporting to him. Because they purported to give information to McNally and then thence back to Washington about high-level military decision-making in Germany, Wilson was actually interested in that. And the Secretary of State was also very interested in that, Leland Harrison. So yeah, but no, it was nothing like, in that regard, it was nothing like what we saw during World War II, let alone in the Cold War, right, where the president in CIA terms is the first customer, right, and he's the, at the end of the day, the most important intelligence consumer. Woodrow Wilson was not an important intelligence consumer in World War I and didn't really like the business. He was a very moralistic man, and he found this whole thing just grubby and distasteful.
And his whole diplomatic thrust was open covenants, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Which is fundamentally
secret. Yeah.
Yeah, fundamentally in tension with much of intelligence and certainly espionage. By the way, I think I just misspoke. I think it said Leland Harrison was Secretary of State. It was actually Robert Lansing,
Yeah.
who, by the way, was the uncle to a guy named Alan Dulles, whom you may have heard of. But,
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of connections back then, and McAdoo as well. But yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about that period, of course, is Wilson may have not been very interested in it from the international point of view, or at least but certainly domestically, he seemed a lot more interested in the issues of subversion and countering that. Correct?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for that. And in fact, if you look at Wilson's speech asking for a declaration of war, and some of the other speeches that he gave up in the run up to this, he doesn't talk explicitly about intelligence, like that word doesn't pass his lips, but on the list of bad things that he says Germany is doing, which ultimately, lead him to ask for a declaration of war, are a lot of these kinds of things. He talks about how the Germany is subverting American society and stealing our secrets and conducting sabotage operations and all of this sort of thing. So in that regard, he is certainly interested in counterintelligence and counter subversion and counter espionage. But he doesn't use those terms, and he doesn't want to get too directly involved in the dealings, with that being taken care of. He's content to take umbrage at them and use that in a political context here in the United States, but he doesn't want to have to personally deal with it.
Finally, I'm going to ask a bigger question, and this is about history and intelligence education. So why should students be concerned about this period? Why would it be worth their time to delve into this history from now over 100 years ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to begin with, I'm a big believer in knowledge of history for its own sake, but that aside, I think it's important to learn from our past generally, and this period, and indeed, U.S. intelligence history more broadly. What worked, what didn't work, what got us into trouble, this sort of thing. I think I've already alluded to some of the abuses, and also, frankly, just the unnecessary level of effort in domestic intelligence and domestic surveillance during World War I that I think we, would have been good for us to have kept in mind at various occasions, including during the Red Scare and in the post 9/11 era. I think that if perhaps people in the sort of decision-making positions after 9/11 had been aware in some detail of how we looked at the Lutheran Church and some of the bad things that had come out of that during World War I, that a few things might have been different here. Also, I mentioned kind of back on the domestic side. I mentioned the American Protective League, right? That the Justice Department gave sort of an imprimatur to be, volunteer counterintelligence office personnel, and indeed supported the Justice Department and naval intelligence and military intelligence and all sorts of things. They got it really out of hand, acted not infrequently like vigilantes. And it's interesting to note that when World War II was looming, the proposal was made to the Justice Department to create a new American Protective League, and J. Edgar Hoover, he remembered World War I, and he was not having it. And so,
right, that is interesting, and there's certain periods where just my impression of Hoover is where all of a sudden you see this sort of this shaft of of enlightenment coming through, right, where it's on the domestic side, like also might have been competing entity, but yeah, there was I recall that, and that's very interesting, and Ralph von Diemen had some role in APL too, is that, as I recall?
Not an APL per se, but well, let me rephrase this. He headed military intelligence division of the War Department, as I say, for the first roughly 1 year of our participation in World War I. And during that time, MID and thus him made extensive use of APL. to do things like basically the precursors to today's background investigations for security clearances, for instance, to track down, do some of the initial investigations on, reports that had come in of, potential German spies or whatever. And it's hard to overstate the extent to which there were innumerable reports of, alleged German spies here, there, or everywhere. To give you one sense, for instance, one actually officer in the U.S. Army got investigated because someone said that his housekeeper looked German, right? And that led to a counterintelligence investigation into this officer. Right? I mean, that's the kind of low threshold here. So when you got just huge amounts of stuff, and like the card files, the counterintelligence card files of ONI and the Military Intelligence Division eventually ran into hundreds of thousands of cards, right? So when you get all of this mostly garbage reporting coming in, they needed help investigating it. So, under him, they were using the APL, extensively. In the interwar period, Van Diemen, he continues on active duty, and he actually has some operational commands positions for a while. He retires in, if I recall correctly, real early 1930s. And he goes basically into the private investigation business. And again, doing a lot of, due diligence kind of work, background investigations on people. He was living out of San Diego, kept card files on suspected communists, particularly in California. And the Navy, Naval Intelligence was known to consult with him on cases they had going in the California area. So yeah, he continued to be a player, and I think there's things to be learned there. And also, I think another reason that thinking about this from the point of view of someone who had taught and teaches, for that matter, university courses about intelligence, there's nice historical examples about tradecraft and different kinds of intelligence concepts from World War I, and indeed other early historical periods, which are, because everything was sort of cleaner and simpler and fewer acronyms and all of this, like the case studies become much more clear of like what are the underlying important moving parts. So, for instance, sometimes when I'm teaching about deception, I will use a case study of the American deception that was conducted to set the stage for the Samuel offensive, which was the first of two major American offenses during World War I, just to discuss deception and how it's put across, because it's actually pretty simple and self-contained and easy to understand, because, governments and militaries were less complicated then.
Less
so I think it's under more business.
Less jargon addicted.
Yeah.
That was
Absolutely.
One of the more pernicious legacies of World War II was the
no question about it.
Of acronyms, right? Okay, so let me get to some of the questions on
please
in our chat here, and I'm going to ask. Gil asked, "What was there a naval equivalent of the War Department's official history in the UK? No. The official history of the World War I blockade was to prove invaluable in World War II." Yeah.
No, ONI and the Office of Naval Intelligence did not do an official history after World War I, much to my regret. And as a broader discussion, I would say that ONI records, surviving records, are from that period are a mess. But no, unfortunately, there was not.
And actually, that is unfortunate, because we practically had to relearn everything by World War II.
Yeah.
With respect to convoys and things like that for this.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, dealing with the U-boat threat. Sheila asked, how did the American public perceive intelligence and in so-called intelligence community back on that in the period we're talking about? Was there much of a public profile of this?
Yeah, there was not, during the war itself, there was not much of a public profile of it. The public was certainly aware before we entered the war of like there's sabotage going on by being conducted by the Germans and this sort of thing, and yet government agents are top men are looking into it, and they were aware, of course, of the American Protective League, It was a mass organization. The American Protective League was 250,000 people by the end of the war. So obviously that's publicly known. But the military particularly tried to keep as secret as it could what it was doing in terms of domestic counterintelligence, domestic surveillance. And, with regard to what was going on in France with the intelligence components of the American Expeditionary Forces, the public knew that there were people out there who were flying planes carrying cameras, but not much was known or understood about what, the actual intelligence staffs did. To a very large degree, the American public perception during the war of intelligence was shaped more by spy fiction than reality. But then what you see after the war is over, you get a lot of people who served in a variety of intelligence capacities during the war who write magazine articles, including for a lot of mass publication magazines, who are interviewed by their hometown papers about what did you do when you were the division or regimental G2. There are even a few books written about American intelligence in World War I that are pretty much basically explainers. And it starts to have much more of a public profile, and its public profile starts to become more grounded in reality. But there was not at all a good general public perception of it during the war at all. And let me also say, people during the war, and this would continue for quite some time, though, tail off, but people during the war tended to frequently conflate intelligence with law enforcement. The intel people in the army, they must be like the criminal investigation division parts, components of the army, right? And you'd hear people talking about Sherlock Holmes as if that were intelligence work, right? So it was not well understood.
Well, and the etymology of the word intelligence too. It's it's just changed so much over the years.
It used to mean basically just information. And in fact, in my hometown of Seattle, a newspaper that I think actually still exists was the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, right? The word has evolved over time, and frequently, often during the World War I period, you started to see an increasing use of the word intelligence and a decreasing use of the word information. So, in 1917, for instance, you were every bit as likely to hear about military information as you were to hear about military intelligence. They were synonymous. But during the war, the word intelligence starts to be sort of crowd out the word information. And by the end of the war, there's almost nobody who's using military information anymore. It's become military intelligence.
Great. Let me get to another one. Based on your research, are there a few things that were done right, say in World War I, that we probably could learn take some lessons from today? I think the U.S. military was actually quite good at doing order of battle analysis during World War I, and as far as I know, they're pretty good at it today too. But the same fundamental methods of doing that are done now were originated in World War I, and largely, though not exclusively, taught to us by the French. So that would certainly be one. You also see, a lot of the really, and this isn't like a forgotten lesson that if only we learned it today from World War I, we'd be better off. But you see this element of continuity of they did some really good stuff at World War I that carries through, even at the sort of very technical level of how to do photographic interpretation, or as these days it's called, imagery analysis, right? And the invention of various techniques to detect camouflage or to look through camouflage, and a lot of very sort of nitty-gritty tradecraft kind of details that are every bit as applicable today as they were then. I mean, there's a great many of them, actually. In terms of forgotten lessons that if only we relearn, I don't think there's much of that per se, except maybe on the domestic surveillance side. But there's a lot of the everyday stuff.
intelligence officers today work on a foundation that was built by intelligence officers in the World War I period.
Right. Let's go back to then another question about that, because this is one that sort of came up when you were talking, was, all right, how do they set priorities? So what were how are they setting collection priorities? So who was telling this collector to go out and collect what, and you mentioned some attachés who were doing some interesting collection. How did they get tasked? And then maybe who was sharing that?
Yeah. So in terms of the attachés doing both their overt intelligence collection functions and also running or at least managing espionage operations, there was surprisingly little guidance on what to collect or what the key, intelligence requirements were from Washington, or indeed from the American Expeditionary Forces putting in requests. A great deal of it, in fact, the vast majority of it, was those individual officers saying, I think this is something somebody would want to know about, and reporting it. Or I think if they they ought to ask me this question, so I'm going to pursue this line of inquiry and see if I can get somebody who can be in position to report on thus and such. With regard to intelligence in the American Expeditionary Forces, however, it was really entirely different. And most of the intelligence collection that was done of all kinds by the American Expeditionary Forces was, more or less directly tasked for fairly tangible, specific sorts of reasons. Aircraft would be sent out because we'd, had a human report, for instance, of a new German headquarters bunker being dug into the ground, in roughly that area over there. Would you go confirm it and get precise location details so maybe we can attack it, for instance. But yeah, in terms of the stuff that ultimately reports to Washington, and here we're talking primarily human, very, very little tasking, very, very little tasking, and certainly no kind of formal national level setting of collection priorities like there's such a big infrastructure to do today. That wasn't a thing.
Yeah, no NERDC, no NIPF. No,
yeah, none of that. None
acronyms.
of that.
Wait, no acronyms.
No acronyms.
Yeah, all right. So let's a question about just history in general on World War I, World War II. So Stephanie asked, what you found this interesting thing that you thought that you'd be looking at a topic that was well covered, but it didn't. It turned out fortuitously that it is not well covered. So
yeah.
Now, but there's so much on World War II. Is this based because there's just so much more to write about in terms of World War II? Is it just the book buyer's preferences? How would you, why the lack of attention on the World War I topic?
Yeah, I think there's multiple reasons here. So first off, without specific regard to intelligence, Americans remember World War II much better than they remember World War I, for a variety of reasons, good and bad, right? One, it was more recent. Two, it was bigger. There's a variety of other reasons. So just American attention on the two wars overall is disproportionately slanted towards World War II. We lost many more people in World War II than we did in World War I. We were in World War II longer. All sorts of reasons that World War II generally gets more attention than World War I. Secondly, on intelligence specifically, there's a fairly widely held view that the U.S. did some intel stuff in World War I. Can't have been very important in any and in any event, it all went away in the interwar period, so it doesn't have a legacy to today. Whereas there's a very immediate, highly visible legacy of American intelligence in World War II, right into the into the Cold War, right? Ask CIA what their predecessor organization is, and they'll tell you the Office of Strategic Services, which is largely, though not totally true. Now, as I've argued in my book, I think that perception that, it all vanished in the interwar period is just simply wrong. So, I mean, I think those are, a couple of the reasons that there's a, sort of big difference there. And well, I guess thirdly, I'd say that not only is it a bigger war and, and a longer war, but the U.S. intelligence effort in World War II was all the more far-flung, right? It was all the bigger, right? So there's, and record keeping was better too, by the way. So there's a bunch of reasons.
We have a declassification question. Let me see.
Yeah.
Segue this a little bit because Amparo asked about if you're writing about something that happened over 100 years ago. What if you wanted to write about something, for example, U.S.-China competition going on now? I mean, when can historians reasonably expect that they'll have access to declassified documents that they could actually figure this out? And the code of that is that still an issue with World War I history writing?
Yeah, real briefly on the second part of that first, it's not an issue in World War I.
Okay.
There are no classified records left that are still classified, from the United States in World War I. I did, in the course of my research, run across a few things where the documents were not in the folders at the National Archives. They had been withdrawn because they were classified. But if you looked at the date on when that happened, it was in the mid-70s. And in every case where I cared enough to put in a Freedom of Information Act request for those documents that have been taken out, I got them. So, for instance, I mentioned that during the war, the Military Intelligence Division had a SIGINT station in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. Well, that was in the official history, the Military Intelligence Division. When that was reviewed in, I think, 1976, they took the 10 pages or so where that gets mentioned out. But they gave them to me in their entirety when I asked for them. So there's nothing classified left from World War I. In terms of, more recent, so it's a kind of a rolling thing, right? There are declassification laws, and I can never remember if it's 25 years or 30, but a lot of stuff gets automatically declassified after 25, I think it's 30 actually, years. But there's a caveat to that. The way things work these days, it's declassified, but it has to be double checked by an actual human reader, because there are a bunch of categories of things, many of which are in the intelligence realm, that don't get declassified automatically at 30 years. So in theory, what's declassified is different from what you could actually lay your hands on if you went to the National Archives today. And then the classification of intelligence materials depends a lot on exactly what kind of stuff we're talking about. Things that would get to identifying human sources. Well, we know a lot of that stuff from World War II. We know very, very little of it from the Cold War, and only basically the specific cases that CIA has chosen to tell us about, mostly because they were success stories. Very, very, very little signals intelligence material has been declassified since World War II. Tiny, tiny bits and pieces, because, SIGINT is special intelligence, right? So it kind of depends on what you're talking about. I'm sorry?
Look how long it took Venona to get declassified.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
So we have thanks for everybody for the great questions. There's one last one I think is a great way to sort of end the program today. And so Henry asked, looking back on what you learned from World War I, and then thinking about the current intelligence climate, is there one constant theme, ethos, skill set that should be taken forward from all this to each generation? You see something like that, can you identify a thread that's important to carry forward? Yeah,
I guess I'd say two things. I mean, there's probably a lot of things that would fit that description. I think two things I'd say is, if you look at the way that the ideal intelligence officer, or the kind of person who'd be good at intelligence, was described back in the World War I era, it's the same kind of attributes that we tend to look for in intelligence officers these days. Of people who are good at thinking, who can separate their emotions from their intellect, who can tell the difference between speculation or inference on the one hand and observable facts on the other. People who are sort of upright, good citizens and know how to keep secrets and honor commitments and all those kinds of attributes that we would use to describe a good analyst, a good case officer, a good whatever these days, fundamental human attributes. You see described then. So that's number one. And number two, I guess, less directly about humans, but sort of a habit. I feel like in every sort of modern instance of American intelligence, there tends to be an overestimation of the adversary, at least as a going-in position, and we certainly saw that in World War I. We saw it in a variety of ways with regard to the Nazis. We saw it with regard to the communists. We saw it with regard to Al Qaeda. All of these were genuine, real, serious threats. But they were the going in assumption of intelligence personnel and others of national security elites tended to be that they were 10 feet tall, when in fact they were all more like 5'10". And I think that's very much a constant, I would argue, throughout American intelligence history, at least over the last 120 years.
Great. Thank you for that, and for a great discussion today. We wish you luck with your book that's soon to come out. And
thank you very much.
All those of you who wish to get up on the topic of World War I intelligence, I'm sure you'll find that a very instructive and enjoyable read. And thanks for answering all our questions today. Sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but this was a good program. I will look forward to having you back.
Great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks everybody for coming.
And one last thing, our next program for Inside Intelligence will be on November 1st, where Deb Watuski, who's former chief of staff at CIA, will talk to us about the art of leadership analysis. And I think you'll really enjoy that program, which is coming up now in November 1st. So, well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Hope to see you all again soon. And that's it for today's Inside Intelligence.